of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Once, St. Francis decided to call together all of his religious community and to gather them for what they called a chapter, which was like a long meeting over a number of days. So he called them together on the plains outside of Assisi, at the place called St. Mary of the Angels. And they all arrived and made their camp. And when they had all gathered, there were more than 5,000 men there for that event. And St. Francis stood up and spoke some anointed words, and he reminded them that they had promised to God very great things, but that God had promised to them even greater things. And he encouraged them to live the manner of life after the gospel and to live in peace. And so he said, and let's make this really practical. And he said, today and during this whole chapter, no one is going to worry about what we are to eat or drink or about our supplies. And there at that event was also another saint, St. Dominic, with 7 of his companions. And he heard St. Francis say this, and he thought to himself, well, this is very imprudent, because with so many people, there will be great suffering for lack of food. But as it turned out, St. Francis was right, because the people of the area, many towns away, heard about what was happening, and they loaded up their wagons with food and supplies, and they brought them to this gathering of the friars and fed them, and they had all that they needed. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in charge of 5,000 people gathered together in one place, I wouldn't have been so easygoing. But this is the difference between the saints and us, is that the saints really believed the words of Scripture. They took them seriously. And we hear today in the second reading, St. Paul says, have no anxiety at all. Have no anxiety at all. This is a very strong statement, and one which a man like St. Francis would take to heart, and which oftentimes the rest of us kind of leave aside. Where did this come from? Well, it came from the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, when he told his disciples, do not be anxious about tomorrow. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. And he gave them the example of nature, of the birds and the flowers, and how God takes care of them, and how they are worth more than the flowers and the birds. And so the teaching of Christ is echoed in the teaching of St. Paul. And it's all nice and everything, but how is it possible? We live in a very anxious time, whether it's from the realities that we face or the technologies that we use that intentionally make us anxious to come back to them again and again. And we might not even believe it's possible not to have anxiety. So maybe we should ask the question in a different way. How is it possible for us to move the needle of our lives from more anxiety to less anxiety? And St. Paul gives us a method in this letter that he wrote. And you'll have to remember that St. Paul wrote this letter while he was in prison. So he had a couple things to be anxious about. But what we should keep in mind, first of all, is that this is not the result of human efforts. It's not as if we do this, if we do that, then we'll be not less anxious or have no anxiety. This is a gift from God. This is a grace. And so this is what St. Paul tells us we should do. First of all, he says we should pray. In everything, by prayer and petition, make your requests known to God. Why do we have to make our requests known to God if he knows exactly what we need? Well, because it is good for us, and he wants us to participate in his generosity. He wants us to ask him, and it allows us to recognize that we are not as independent as we'd like to think, that we are truly dependent upon the goodness of God in all situations of our life. And so we should pray in everything, as St. Paul says. It's easy to pray when things are really bad and when we have no other options, and we say, I should pray. But when, in the course of our daily life, we have normal things, that's when we should also pray, asking God to bestow his generosity upon us day in and day out. The second thing that St. Paul says is that we should have thanksgiving, that we should be grateful in every situation, again, recognizing that everything is a gift. The gospel today, we hear about a landowner who leased his vineyard to tenants. And one of the things that it teaches us is that everything that we have is really on loan. It is just leased to us. One day we will have to give it back. We can't keep it forever. And so we are just taking good care of it as stewards. And so we should thank God for this. And it's easy to thank God in good times when the things go well, but it is much more difficult to thank him when things are not as good. But St. Paul tells us that we should give thanks in all circumstances, because if we do that, then our happiness and our peace will not be contingent upon our present circumstances, which change all the time. This past couple weeks in the weekday readings at Mass, we have been reading about Job in the Old Testament, and poor Job, he lost everything that he had, all of his livestock, his land. He lost all of his children. And how did he respond? He said, "The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be God." Blessed be God. If we can say that in the midst of our difficulties, then we will truly be grateful. And this is the medicine that heals our grief and our distress. Finally, St. Paul tells us what we should think about. He gives a list of different things that we should keep in mind as we contemplate them. He says we should think about what is true and honorable and just and pure and lovely and gracious. And the problem is that we face today a tsunami of information and influx of data, and this can lead to anxiety. And most of the time, what we take into our lives is not like this list. It's more like the opposite. We take in what is false or dishonorable, what is unjust or impure, what is ugly or degraded. These are the things that we take into our lives, and what happens as a result? It just increases our anxiety. It doesn't give us peace. So St. Paul says we should focus on what is truly good. We should read the life of Christ in the Gospels every day instead of doing some other things that might make us more anxious. We should read the lives of the saints to see how they live their lives and how we might take from them. We should contemplate the beauty of nature. This Catholic philosopher wrote a couple months ago, and he said that we should stop watching the news and just go outside and look at trees. And I haven't stopped keeping track of the news, but I have started to pay attention more to the trees. I tell you what, I think he's onto something. If we just looked at the trees and see how beautiful they are and how they stay the same, then we might be a little less anxious, because we will be contemplating what is good. That's the final thing that St. Paul tells us. So those three things, prayer, thanksgiving, and the contemplation of what is good, these are the method that allows us to lessen the anxiety of our lives. And one of the ways that we see this is in the example of little children. They know that they are loved by their parents, that they are protected, that they are provided for, and they don't have many cares in the world. And Jesus tells us that this is how we are to live if we want to enter the kingdom of heaven. We should be childlike. You know, the children sometimes look back at their parents to make sure that they're there, but most of the time they don't, but they know that their parents are watching them. And this is how it should be for us, because we all have a Father who loves us and delights in us and who cares for all of our needs. At times, we turn to him in prayer and we see him, but more often we just know that he is watching out for us, that our lives are in his hands, and that he wants to provide for all that we need. And so we should have that kind of like childlike trust and confidence in God, and that can help us to be at peace and to live a less anxious life. So with gratitude today for the gifts that God has given to us, let us put this into practice, to pray, to give thanks, and to contemplate what is good, so that we can lessen our anxiety and live more like the children, the childlike, that to whom God gives the kingdom, and more like St. Francis, who had a very peaceful life. That is what he's given to us, and that is our inheritance as the children of God.